We used to believe that democracy began with ancient Athens. Now we believe that it is as old as humanity. We also know that it doesn't last, and that the dictatorships that replace it lead to brutality and civil collapse. Is there a way out of this cycle? Many are trying to find it.
The folk theory of democracy never really had a chance. Though it is still popular with the average citizen, it has been abandoned by theorists and scholars. In the late 1950s, a new proposal was suggested by economists that caused a buzz. It was called the Spatial Model of Elections. The Spatial Model of Democracy was both a refinement and a simplification of the naive theory. The spatial model imagines a left-right continuum on which most people would be able to identify their ideological position. This is not a particularly mysterious theory, as the spectrum is the left-right graph, familiar to pretty much everyone. According to the theory, whether or not everyone has an opinion on every available policy controversy, voters will have a pretty good idea as to where they land on the graph and will vote for politicians that appear closest to their own ideological position. In that manner, voters are not voting for people with explicit policy preferences that match their own, but rather for politicians that share an ideological space, with a reasonable expectation that their policy preferences are likely to be agreeable to the voter. Those candidates elected then will go on to shape the ideology of the government in the likeness of the ideology of the voters. The theory has since been upgraded in a few ways, including multiple single-issue spectrums as opposed to one single spectrum, but the basic concept is the same. While this is the more popular paradigm with theorists, it shares many of the same problems that the naive theory holds. Recognizing that 85% of voters are rationally ignorant, one has to wonder whether a voter could accurately place themselves on an ideological graph. In fact, studies generally conclude that voters cannot. They're confused as to where they stand on the left-right spectrum, even when they had convictions on several controversial issues of the day. Just as everyone thinks they are the only person in a crowd of travelers without an accent, most voters think they are centrists. Even more interesting, surveys from 10 to 15 years ago found that those with the most radical attitudes towards democratic institutions rated themselves the most centrist. Compounding the problem that voters don't generally know where they stand ideologically, often their opinions on specific issues don't make ideological sense. One example of that was a study done in the mid-1980s that found that 64% of voters thought that the US government was spending too little on assistance to the poor, but only around 22% reported that the government was spending too little on welfare. As they are two words meaning exactly the same thing, the 42% of the voters with contradictory opinions would fit on two different locations on a spatial graph of the exact same issue. There are plenty of examples of this type of paradox coming out of studies. For example, about half of Americans would not permit a communist to give a speech, whereas only about a quarter would forbid it. Before the 1991 Gulf War, almost two-thirds were willing to use military force, less than half were willing to engage in combat, and less than 30% were willing to go to war. Granted that each phrase paints a slightly different picture in the mind of the severity of the fighting, all of them point to the same policy of using military force, and the differences of opinions point to preferred outcomes, not policies. Trying to graph these opinions ideologically would look more like a Jackson Pollock painting than a line graph. Even if the voter is so irrationally knowledgeable that they understand the issues and know where they stand personally, candidates are constantly trying to be everything to everybody and will muddy the water whenever possible. As we mentioned in the last video, only around 70% choose the candidate that best matches their ideology and policy position. So correctly guessing the candidate's positions on a spatial graph is not at all a given. As if it weren't enough that voters rarely know where they fit on an ideological spectrum, and often don't understand where the candidates fit, the Carnegie Endowment, a Washington, D.C. think tank, published a study in September of 2023 that demonstrated that the particular American system of primaries is leaving American voters with candidates that are far more radical than the voters themselves. Only 20% of voters vote in primaries, and the candidates they choose are far more extreme than the voters in the general election. That's not a big surprise. Primary voters tend to be the more activist and have the strongest convictions, and it seems reasonable to assume that they would be more polarized also. When questioned on policy, average voters tend to clump towards the center far more than the candidates that win the primaries do. Unfortunately, what we are learning is that voters tend to choose a candidate, sometimes reluctantly, but then start to mold their own opinions after that candidate's opinions. The result is that the candidates often tend to radicalize the general voter as they normalize more extreme positions. We will discuss that in more details in a future video. The spatial model was a good, common sense construct that seemed to promise a good answer as to how the will of the people gets turned into policy, despite the voters' policy ignorance. Unfortunately, it turns out to be largely myth. Voters are actually more centrist than previously understood, but the most radical place themselves as the most centrist, and the rest rarely have a clear idea where they would actually be. To add insult to injury, our voting system rarely provides candidates anywhere near the voters' ideologies, making the model a mismatch to what we know about the American democratic experience. In our next video, we will discuss the retrospective accountability theory of democracy. And while we are learning that retrospective accountability doesn't provide the whole picture of how democracy works, it is bringing us much closer to a real working theory. I'll see you in that video.